The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Aisha walked home from band practice, her trumpet case swinging gently by her side. At 15, she was already first chair in her high school band, and today's practice had gone exceptionally well. The street lights were just starting to flicker on in the peaceful suburban neighborhood she'd called home all her life. She hummed the melody from their upcoming concert piece, her school uniform neat and tidy beneath her favorite navy blue hoodie. The familiar houses of her neighbors lined both sides of the street. Mrs. Chen watering her prized roses, old Mr. Patel walking his golden retriever, and the Rodriguez kids playing basketball in their driveway. Just 3 more houses until she'd be home, where Mom's famous lasagna would be waiting. But the peaceful evening shattered when a police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed behind her. Officer Barrett had been watching her for the last 10 minutes, following slowly in his patrol car. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and lately his colleagues had started noticing his growing tendency to stop people of color for what he called routine checks. "Stop right there." His voice boomed through the quiet street, making Aisha freeze mid-step. The trumpet case suddenly felt heavy in her hands as she heard car doors slam and the clicking of boots on pavement. In the growing darkness, she could make out 2 shapes approaching. Officer Barrett and his canine partner, a large German shepherd straining against its leash. "What's in the case?" Barrett demanded, his flashlight beam harsh against Aisha's eyes. She blinked, trying to stay calm like her parents had taught her. "It's my trumpet, sir. I'm in the school band. I'm just walking home from practice." "Sure you are," Barrett scoffed, his grip tightening on the canine's leash. "Open it." Slowly. The neighbors started emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen set down her watering can, watching with concern. Mr. Patel pulled out his phone, quietly beginning to record. Aisha's hands trembled slightly as she set down her case. "Sir, I live right there." She pointed toward her house, visible just 3 doors down. "My dad's probably waiting for me. You can call him." I said open it. Barrett cut her off, his voice rising. The canine growled, picking up on its handler's tension. Aisha reached for the case latches, moving deliberately to show she wasn't a threat. But to Barrett, still caught in his web of prejudice and paranoia, the simple movement registered as something sinister. "She's reaching." He shouted, though it was clear to everyone watching that Aisha was just doing exactly what he'd ordered. In one fluid motion, Barrett unclipped the canine's leash. Time seemed to slow down as several things happened at once. Mrs. Chen screamed a warning. Mr. Patel's phone captured everything in stark detail, and the Rodriguez kids stopped their game to stare in horror. The dog lunged forward, trained fangs finding Aisha's arm and leg. Her trumpet clattered to the ground as she fell, her scream piercing the evening air. The sound carried all the way to her house, where her father, one of the most respected federal judges in the state, was just settling in to review case files. In the chaos that followed, neighbors rushed forward. Mrs. Chen wrapped her gardening apron around Aisha's bleeding arm while Mr. Patel kept recording, his hands shaking but steady enough to document everything. The Rodriguez father called 911 while his wife ran to get Aisha's parents. Barrett stood there, suddenly uncertain as he saw the crowd gathering, phones recording his every move. The certainty that had fueled his actions moments ago began to crumble as he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the consequences of his actions would soon ripple far beyond this quiet suburban street. In the distance, a door slammed. Heavy footsteps pounded the pavement as Judge Tyson sprinted toward his daughter, his face a mask of fury and fear. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for Aisha and her family, but for the entire community and the system that had allowed this to happen. Time seemed to freeze on that suburban street as Officer Barrett faced the young girl with her trumpet case. The evening had started like any other, but something dark in Barrett's mind had twisted an innocent scene into a threat that existed only in his imagination. Let me see some ID, he barked, his flashlight beam still trained on Aisha's face. She squinted against the harsh light, her heart pounding. The street lamps cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the autumn wind carried the worried whispers of watching neighbors. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice steady despite her fear. She'd been raised to stay calm in situations like this, though her parents had hoped she'd never need those lessons. My school ID is in my pocket. I'm going to reach for it. Okay. But Barrett had already made up his mind about what he was seeing. In his warped view, shaped by years of unchecked prejudice, he didn't see a talented young musician heading home. He saw what he wanted to see, a threat that needed to be contained. Stop, he shouted as she slowly moved her hand toward her pocket. His canine partner, sensing its handler's tension, pulled against the leash, teeth bared. The neighbors watched in horror, their phones recording every moment. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled as she pressed them against her mouth. Mr. Patel stepped closer, his phone steady, knowing that what he was recording might be crucial later. Please, Aisha said, her voice cracking slightly. My house is right there. My parents are home. You can talk to them. She pointed toward her home, its porch light glowing warmly just 3 doors down. The distance had never seemed so far. The Rodriguez kids had stopped their basketball game, the ball rolling forgotten down the driveway. Their father stood protectively in front of them, already dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher's voice seemed distant and unreal as he reported what was unfolding. Barrett's face twisted with unwarranted anger. I said don't move. The K9 growled louder, feeding off its handler's aggressive energy. Aisha froze, her hand still halfway to her pocket, tears beginning to well in her eyes. The next few seconds played out like a nightmare in slow motion. As Aisha struggled to keep her balance, her trumpet case slipped slightly in her grip. The simple movement, just a child trying not to drop her instrument, was all Barrett needed to justify his next action. Without warning, he released the dog. The neighbors' screams filled the air as the trained K9 launched forward. Aisha didn't even have time to raise her arms in defense before the dog's teeth found her. The trumpet case crashed to the ground, the lashes popping open to reveal exactly what she'd said it was, just a trumpet, gleaming under the streetlights. The sound of the attack drew more neighbors from their homes. Mrs. Chen ran forward with her gardening apron, her nurturing instincts overriding her fear. Mr. Patel moved closer, making sure to capture every detail while calling out to Barrett to stop this madness. Through the chaos, a deeper sound cut through the night, the slam of a front door 3 houses down. Judge Tyson, already changed into his evening clothes after a long day at court, heard the commotion and his daughter's cry. The sight that greeted him as he rushed outside would be forever burned into his memory. Barrett finally called off his dog, but the damage was done. He stood there, suddenly uncertain as the reality of his actions began to sink in. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their phones raised like silent witnesses to his abuse of power. In their faces, he saw not the fear he was used to commanding, but something far more dangerous to a man like him, unified outrage. The night air carried the sound of approaching sirens, called by multiple concerned neighbors. But it wasn't the backup Barrett had expected to reassure him. Instead, each wailing siren marked another witness to his indefensible actions, another nail in the coffin of his career, and the beginning of a justice that would shake the entire department to its core. Judge Tyson was reviewing a stack of court papers when he heard the screams. He'd loosened his tie and settled into his favorite armchair, expecting another quiet evening waiting for his daughter to return from band practice. Instead, the sound of chaos erupted from the street outside. His coffee cup clattered to the floor as he rushed to the window. The scene that greeted him through the glass made his blood run cold. His daughter was on the ground, surrounded by neighbors. Without even stopping to put on shoes, he sprinted out the door. The distance between his front porch and the scene seemed endless. Each step brought more details into focus. Mrs. Chen pressing her gardening apron against his daughter's arm, Mr. Patel recording everything on his phone, and Officer Barrett standing there with his K9, looking less certain by the second. "What have you done?" The judge's voice carried the weight of 20 years on the federal bench, but now it shook with a father's rage and fear. The crowd parted as he approached, some neighbors reaching out to steady him, others pointing their phones to capture his arrival. His daughter looked up at him, trying to be brave despite her tears. "Dad," she managed to say, her voice small but steady. "I was just coming home from practice." The trumpet case lay open beside her, its contents spilled across the sidewalk, sheet music scattered by the evening breeze, the instrument itself bearing a new dent from the fall. The judge knelt beside his daughter, his judicial composure warring with parental anguish. He'd seen countless cases of police misconduct from the bench, but nothing had prepared him for seeing his own child become a victim. His hands trembled as he helped Mrs. Chen apply pressure to the wound. Officer Barrett shifted uncomfortably, finally seeming to realize who was kneeling before him. The judge's reputation for fairness and strict adherence to the law was well known throughout the district. "Sir, I was just following protocol," he began, but his words died in his throat as the judge looked up at him. Protocol. The word carried years of contained fury at similar excuses heard in his courtroom. Was it protocol to set a K9 unit on an unarmed child? Was it protocol to ignore her school uniform, her instrument, her explanation? Each question hit like a gavel's strike. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder. The Rodriguez family had called not just emergency services, but also the precinct captain directly. They knew this wasn't a situation for regular patrol officers to handle. Mr. Patel stepped forward, his phone still recording. "I have everything, Your Honor." From the moment he stopped her. The judge nodded, his legal mind already working despite his emotional turmoil. He knew the importance of documentation, of witnesses, of proper procedure. But right now, his daughter's quiet crying demanded all his attention. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, holding her hand. "We're going to make this right." He looked up at the gathering of neighbors. Mrs. Chen with her torn gardening apron, the Rodriguez family standing united, Mr. Patel still documenting everything. In their faces, he saw not just concern but determination. They were all witnesses now, and they wouldn't let this injustice slide. The ambulance arrived first, its red lights painting the street in surreal flashes. The paramedics moved efficiently, their gentle professionalism a stark contrast to Barrett's earlier brutality. As they worked, the judge stood up slowly, his daughter's blood staining his white shirt cuffs. He turned to face Officer Barrett, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "You thought you were powerful tonight," the judge said quietly, his words carrying to every listening ear. "You thought that badge and that dog made you untouchable. But you've never seen real power, the power of justice, properly served." The precinct captain's car pulled up, lights flashing. As his daughter was carefully loaded into the ambulance, Judge Tyson made a silent promise. This wouldn't be handled with angry threats or hasty revenge. No, this would be dealt with through the full force of the law, through every legal channel and proper procedure. Officer Barrett had unleashed more than just his K9 unit tonight. He'd unleashed a father's determination to protect not just his daughter, but every child who might face such treatment in the future. The emergency room buzzed with activity as Judge Tyson paced the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd made 3 crucial calls in the last hour. First of his longtime friend in internal affairs, then to the head of the Civil Rights Division, and finally to a trusted colleague who specialized in police misconduct cases. His wife sat beside their daughter's hospital bed, holding her hand while the doctor examined the K9 bites. The judge paused his pacing to watch through the window, his heart heavy. He'd spent years ensuring justice from behind the bench, but now the system he served had turned on his own child. "We need everything documented," He spoke quietly into his phone. Photos, witness statements, the K-9 unit's training records, everything. His colleague on the other end understood the urgency. They'd worked together on similar cases, but never one so personal. Outside the hospital room, neighbors began arriving. Mrs. Chen brought fresh clothes to replace the bloodied school uniform. Mr. Patel came with his phone, ready to transfer the video evidence. The Rodriguez family arrived with dinner for everyone, knowing from experience that hospital cafeteria food wouldn't cut it on a night like this. "Your Honor," Mr. Patel said, approaching carefully. "I've uploaded the video to 3 different secure locations, and 5 other neighbors have footage from different angles." The judge nodded gratefully. In his years on the bench, he'd seen too many cases where evidence mysteriously disappeared. The precinct captain arrived next, looking troubled. He'd known Judge Tyson for years, had testified in his courtroom many times. "This isn't how we train our officers," he started, but the judge held up a hand. "I know," Judge Tyson replied. "That's why we're going to handle this by the book. No shortcuts, no cover-ups, no quiet settlements. My daughter deserves better. Every child deserves better." Inside the room, his daughter was telling her story to a gentle-voiced detective from Internal Affairs. Her mother squeezed her hand supportively as she described how quickly the routine walk home had turned into a nightmare. The detective took careful notes, his face growing grimmer with each detail. The judge watched through the window, his mind already mapping out the path ahead. He knew the system's flaws, its tendency to protect its own. But he also knew its strengths, the power of properly documented evidence, the weight of community witnesses, the importance of following every procedure to the letter. His phone buzzed again. The Civil Rights Division had already started their preliminary investigation. Officer Barrett's record was being pulled, his previous complaints examined. The K-9 unit's training logs were being reviewed. Nothing would be overlooked. Mrs. Chen approached with a cup of coffee. "We're all behind you," she said softly. "Whatever you need." The judge looked around at the gathering of neighbors, all there to support his family. He saw in their faces the same determination he felt. This incident wouldn't be brushed aside. The doctor emerged from the room with treatment instructions and follow-up appointments. Physical wounds would heal, but the judge knew the emotional recovery would take longer. Still, as he watched his daughter managing a small smile for the Rodriguez kids who'd brought her favorite cookies, he saw her strength shining through. "Dad," she called out, her voice tired but steady. "Are we really going to fight this?" The judge walked over and sat beside her bed. "Yes, sweetheart. But we're going to do it the right way. Not with anger or revenge, but with justice." He looked at the assembled neighbors, the caring medical staff, the dedicated investigators. And we're not fighting alone. As night settled over the hospital, plans were already in motion. Evidence was being gathered, statements taken, procedures followed. Officer Barrett might have had the power of badge and a K-9 unit, but he was about to learn about a different kind of power. The power of justice, properly pursued, backed by community support and an unwavering commitment to change. The Internal Affairs office buzzed with unusual energy that morning. Investigators pored over Officer Barrett's personnel file, pulling out document after document. What they found painted a disturbing picture, one that should have been spotted long ago. Detective Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from the neighborhood, shook his head as he added another complaint to the growing pile on his desk. "Look at this," he called to his partner. 6 complaints of excessive force in the last year alone, all swept under the rug. The investigation was moving faster than usual, pushed by both public pressure and the judge's reputation. But it wasn't cutting corners. If anything, it was more thorough than ever. Every complaint against Barrett was being reopened, every witness re-interviewed. Down the hall, tech specialists reviewed body camera footage from Barrett's previous stops. A pattern emerged. The same aggressive approach, the same escalation, the same targeting of minorities. The only difference this time was that he'd picked the wrong family to harass. Got another one, called out an investigator holding up a dusty file from 5 years back. K-9 unit deploy on a teenager walking home from soccer practice. Case disappeared after Barrett's sergeant buried the paperwork. The room grew quiet as they realized how long this had been going on. In his office at the courthouse, Judge Tyson reviewed copies of everything the investigation uncovered. His daughter was recovering at home, surrounded by supportive neighbors, but the images of that night still haunted him. He'd taken himself off any cases involving the police department, ensuring there would be no conflict of interest. His phone rang. The Civil Rights Division had found something big. Barrett's K-9 training records showed his dog had been flagged for aggressive behavior 3 times, but he'd been allowed to keep working without additional training. The judge made careful notes, building a picture of systemic failure. Back at Internal Affairs, Detective Chen interviewed Barrett's former partners. Most stayed quiet, protected by the blue wall of silence, but one rookie spoke up. He always said he could smell trouble, the young officer admitted. But all he could smell was his own prejudice. The investigation spread beyond Barrett. Why had supervisors ignored the warning signs? How had so many complaints disappeared? Each answer led to more questions, revealing cracks in the system that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Community members came forward with their own stories. The Rodriguez family shared security camera footage from previous incidents. Mr. Patel compiled a database of witness accounts. Mrs. Chen organized other neighbors to provide statements. What started as one incident was becoming a spotlight on years of unchecked abuse. In the break room at Internal Affairs, Detective Chen refilled his coffee cup, thinking about his own kids. "You know what's different this time?" he said to his partner. "We're not just checking boxes. We're actually doing our job." The evidence mounted: training failures, missing reports, buried complaints, altered statistics. Barrett's behavior hadn't developed in a vacuum. It had been enabled by a system more interested in protecting its own than serving the public. Judge Tyson received daily updates, each one strengthening his resolve. He'd seen many investigations in his career, but this one was different. This time, the truth wouldn't be buried in paperwork or lost in the system. This time, real change was coming. By week's end, Internal Affairs had compiled enough evidence to fill 3 boxes. Barrett's career was effectively over, but that was just the beginning. The investigation had revealed something bigger, a broken system that needed fixing from the ground up. As Detective Chen sealed the last box of evidence, he thought about the young girl who'd just been walking home from band practice. Because of her, and because of her father's dedication to proper justice, years of hidden misconduct were finally coming to light. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. The community center buzzed with energy as neighbors filled every seat. What started as a small gathering had grown into something bigger. People from all over the city had come to share their stories and show support. The room was packed, but you could hear a pin drop when Judge Tyson's daughter stepped up to the microphone. Her arm still showed healing marks from the K-9 attack, but her voice was strong. "I was just walking home from band practice," she began. Something so normal shouldn't end in fear. Around the room, heads nodded. Too many people knew exactly what she meant. Mrs. Chen stood up next, still wearing her gardening apron. "I've lived on that street for 30 years, she said. "Watched kids grow up, families come and go. What happened that night? It broke my heart, but it also woke us up. We can't be quiet anymore." The meeting wasn't about anger, though there was plenty to be angry about. Instead, people shared ideas for change. The Rodriguez kids had started a youth committee to educate their peers about their rights. Mr. Patel was developing an app to safely record and store videos of police interactions. At the back of the room, several police officers listened respectfully. They weren't there to defend Barrett. They were there to learn. One officer, close to retirement, spoke up. "I've been on the force for 27 years," he said. "What happened that night doesn't represent what we're supposed to stand for." Community leaders outlined the demands for reform: better training, real oversight, regular reviews of officer behavior. But they also offered partnership. Local teachers volunteered to help with cultural sensitivity training. Business owners offered their security cameras for transparency. Religious leaders opened their doors for community police dialogues. Judge Tyson watched from the sideline, proud of how his neighbors had transformed their outrage into action. His daughter's trauma had sparked something powerful. Not a riot, not a violent uprising, but a determined movement for real change. The media had picked up the story, but they weren't finding the conflict they'd expected. Instead of angry protesters facing off against defensive police, they found community meetings, constructive dialogues, and practical solutions being proposed. "See those kids?" Mrs. Chen pointed to a group of teenagers making posters. "They're not asking for much, just to walk home without fear, to play in their neighborhoods, to be seen as who they are, not what someone assumes they might be." The precinct captain attended every meeting, taking notes and really listening. He brought younger officers with him, wanting them to understand that the community they served wasn't an enemy to be feared, but neighbors to be protected. Local businesses put up signs supporting reform. The high school band dedicated their next concert to promoting unity. Even the coffee shop where Officer Barrett used to get his morning coffee posted a clear message: "In this community, everyone deserves respect." As evening fell, people lingered after the meeting, sharing snacks and stories. The Rodriguez family had brought their famous empanadas. Mrs. Chen's cookies disappeared quickly. Mr. Patel shared samosas from his wife's recipe. Food brought people together, made hard conversations easier. A young rookie officer approached Judge Tyson's daughter. "I'm training to be a K-9 handler," she said softly. "I want you to know, we're learning from what happened. It won't be the same for the next generation." The movement grew beyond their neighborhood. Other communities reached out, sharing similar stories, asking for advice on organizing their own reform efforts. What happened on that quiet suburban street had touched a nerve, but the response wasn't just about one incident or one officer. As people headed home that evening, the mood was hopeful. Signs and posters were carefully stored for the next meeting. Contact information was exchanged. Plans were made. This wasn't just a moment of protest. It was the beginning of real change, built on understanding, respect, and the simple belief that everyone deserves to feel safe in their own community. The courthouse halls fell silent as Officer Barrett walked in for his first hearing. Gone was his confident strut, replaced by the uncertain steps of someone facing real consequences. His lawyer walked beside him, carrying a thick folder of papers that would do little to explain away what dozens of videos had captured. Judge Tyson sat in the public gallery, not on the bench. He'd made sure another judge would handle the case, one known for being fair but firm. His daughter sat beside him, her hand gripping his. This was her first time back in any official building since that night, and her courage showed in every steady breath. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor stood, her expression serious as she laid out the charges. Behind her, a screen showed multiple angles of that night: Mr. Patel's video, Mrs. Chen's doorbell camera, the Rodriguez family's security footage. Barrett seemed to shrink in his chair as he watched himself release the K-9 on an innocent teenager. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal Affairs had done their job thoroughly this time. Every complaint that had been buried over the years was now brought to light. Former victims sat in the gallery, some seeing each other for the first time, realizing they weren't alone in what they'd experienced. The defense tried their usual tactics, talking about split-second decisions, the dangers of police work, the need to maintain order. But these arguments fell flat against the clear video evidence and the stack of ignored complaints. Even Barrett's own K-9 training records showed he'd been warned about excessive force. During a break, People gathered in the hallway. The Rodriguez kids had taken a day off school to attend, understanding the importance of this moment. Mrs. Chen passed out water bottles and supportive smiles. Mr. Patel spoke quietly with other witnesses, sharing their relief that the truth was finally coming out. Back in session, Barrett's former sergeant took the stand. Under oath, he had to admit to burying complaints, to ignoring warning signs, to prioritizing protection of a bad officer over protection of the public. His testimony opened the door to broader changes in the department. Judge Tyson watched it all with mixed emotions. As a father, he felt the pain fresh again, seeing his daughter's attack replayed on screen. As a judge, he appreciated seeing the system work as it should, methodically and fairly. As a member of the community, he felt hope seeing justice finally being served. The prosecutor presented expert testimony about proper K-9 handling procedures, showing how far Barrett had strayed from protocol. She showed statistics of his stops, revealing clear patterns of bias. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of abuse of power. During lunch break, a young rookie officer approached Judge Tyson's daughter. "Your case changed things at the academy," she said softly. "They're teaching it now. How to spot bad behavior, how to report it, why staying silent makes us part of the problem." The defense's case crumbled under cross-examination. Barrett's excuses about feeling threatened by a teenager with a trumpet case seemed almost laughable now. His previous victims testified about similar encounters, showing a clear pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. As the day wound down, the courthouse steps filled with community members. They weren't there to protest or shout slogans. They were there to show support for a system finally working as it should, holding those in power accountable for their actions. Judge Tyson and his daughter walked out together, surrounded by their neighbors. The sight would stay with many who witnessed it. Not just a father and daughter seeking justice, but a community standing together, proving that change was possible when people refused to look away from wrongdoing. The next hearing was scheduled, but everyone knew this was already a turning point. It wasn't just about one officer facing consequences. It was about setting a new standard, about showing that the badge meant responsibility, not immunity. Real change was happening, one court session at a time. The police training academy looked different now. New posters lined the walls showing community engagement success stories. In the main classroom, a group of cadets sat attentively as Judge Tyson's daughter shared her experience. No phones, no whispered conversations, just focused attention on a story that had changed their department. "I don't share this to make you feel bad," she told them, her voice clear and strong. "I share it because you have the power to make sure it never happens again." In the back of the room, the new police chief nodded. He'd been appointed after the previous administration stepped down, committed to rebuilding trust from the ground up. The changes were real and visible. Every K-9 unit now wore body cameras. Training focused on de-escalation first. Officers spent time in the communities they served, not just patrolling through them. The Rodriguez kids had even started a youth advisory council, meeting regularly with police leadership. Mrs. Chen's garden had become an unlikely symbol of change. She'd turned it into a community space where officers and neighbors could gather informally. "Hard to fear someone when you've shared my homemade lemonade," she'd say with a smile. Even the toughest veterans found themselves warming to her approach. In the precinct, Mr. Patel's app had been officially adopted. Every police interaction was now recorded and uploaded to a secure server, protecting both officers and citizens. "Transparency isn't just a word anymore," the new chief explained. "It's how we do business." The reform went deeper than new rules and cameras. Officers now had regular meetings with community leaders, not just when problems arose. They walked the streets they patrolled, learning names, understanding the neighborhoods. The us versus them mentality was being replaced by something better, a sense of shared community. Training methods changed dramatically. Instead of just learning about power and control, Cadets studied communication and cultural understanding. They learned about bias not through boring lectures, but through real conversations with community members who shared their experiences. The old guard struggled with the changes at first. "This isn't how we used to do things," they'd grumble. But seeing the results, lower tension, fewer complaints, more solved cases through community cooperation, even the skeptics began to come around. Judge Tyson watched it all from his courthouse office. He'd helped design some of the new oversight measures, ensuring they had real teeth while remaining fair to good officers. His daughter had become a regular speaker at police training sessions, turning her trauma into a tool for positive change. The Community Oversight Board became a model for other cities. Citizens and officers worked together, reviewing complaints, suggesting improvements, celebrating successes. It wasn't always smooth, real change never is, but it was genuine progress. In the K-9 unit, things had changed the most. The new handling protocols emphasized control and restraint. Dogs were trained as a last resort, not a first response. The rookie who'd spoken to the judge's daughter was now leading the unit, bringing a fresh perspective to an old program. The Rodriguez family's basketball games now often included off-duty officers. Mrs. Chen's garden hosted monthly community meetings. Mr. Patel's tech expertise was regularly consulted on new transparency initiatives. What had started as a response to tragedy had grown into a genuine partnership. 1 year after that terrible night, the department held an open house. The turnout surprised everyone. Families, kids, elderly residents, all coming to see the changes for themselves. The walls displayed photos of joint community projects, statistics showing improved relations, plans for future initiatives. The new chief stood with Judge Tyson's daughter, looking at a photo of that night's protest. Sometimes, he said quietly, "We need a mirror held up to see ourselves clearly. You helped us see what we needed to change." She smiled, thinking of all the young people who could now walk home without fear. The reforms weren't perfect, no system is, but they were real, measurable, and growing stronger every day. What happened that night with Officer Barrett had opened eyes and hearts to the need for change. Now that change wasn't just a promise or a policy. It was becoming reality, one day at a time. 2 years had passed since that autumn evening when a simple walk home from band practice changed everything. The neighborhood looked different now, not in its buildings or streets, but in the way people moved through it. Kids played freely, neighbors chatted on porches, and when police cars drove by, they were met with waves instead of worry. Judge Tyson stood in his front yard, watching his daughter practice her trumpet on the porch. The sound carried clearly in the evening air. She'd become first chair in the city youth orchestra. Her scars had faded, but her determination hadn't. She'd turned her experience into a force for change, speaking at police academies across the state. Officer Barrett's trial had ended with justice served, a conviction that sent a clear message about accountability. But more importantly, it had sparked changes that went far beyond one officer or one incident. The police department had transformed from within, becoming a model for other cities looking to rebuild community trust. Mrs. Chen's garden had bloomed into a community gathering space. Today, rookie officers were helping her plant new roses, while neighbors stopped by with watering cans and conversation. The garden that had once witnessed trauma now nurtured healing and connection. The Rodriguez kids had grown too. The oldest was now studying criminal justice in college, inspired to change the system from within. Their weekly basketball games had become a neighborhood tradition, with off-duty officers often joining in. Mr. Patel's security camera business had expanded to include training programs on responsible surveillance and community safety. At the police academy, a new class of cadets was graduating. Among them was a young woman who had been inspired by the changes she'd seen in her community. During her speech, she mentioned that night 2 years ago, not as a dark moment, but as the beginning of real transformation. The new oversight board had teeth now, with real power to investigate and recommend changes. but they found themselves dealing with fewer complaints each month. Officers trained in de-escalation and community engagement were building bridges instead of barriers. The K-9 units, once symbols of fear, now regularly visited schools for friendly demonstrations. Judge Tyson had returned to his regular duties, but with a deeper understanding of how justice worked, or didn't work, on the streets. His courtroom had become known as a place where everyone, regardless of badge or background, was held to the same standard. The community center hosted monthly meetings where residents and police officers talked openly about concerns and solutions. Tonight's topic was youth programs, finding ways to help kids see officers as mentors rather than threats. The room was full, the conversation honest and hopeful. Local businesses had gotten involved too. The coffee shop now hosted Coffee with a Cop events where residents could chat informally with officers. The bookstore had a section dedicated to understanding civil rights and community policing. Even the ice cream parlor had named a flavor community suite, with proceeds supporting youth programs. As sunset painted the sky, neighbors gathered for an impromptu concert on Mrs. Chen's lawn. The judge's daughter played her trumpet, while younger kids tried to follow along on their own instruments. Officers on patrol stopped to listen, some sitting cross-legged on the grass with residents. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and they hadn't always been easy. But step by step, person by person, the community had shown that real transformation was possible. What started with one father's determination to get justice for his daughter had grown into something bigger, a model for how police and communities could work together. Looking at his daughter playing her heart out on the porch, Judge Tyson felt a deep sense of pride, not just in her courage and resilience, but in how their neighborhood had come together to turn a moment of injustice into lasting change. The old fears hadn't completely disappeared, but they were being replaced by something stronger: hope, understanding, and a shared commitment to doing better. As the music filled the evening air, it carried a message that had become the community's truth. Real power wasn't in force or fear, but in justice, understanding, and the courage to change. That message, like the trumpet's clear notes, would carry far beyond their neighborhood, touching other communities ready for their own transformation.